Good morning and welcome all to our fifth webinar of the Independent School Board Mastery Series. This webinar series is developed in partnership with our friends GovernWith and supported by the Governance Institute of Australia. For those that have not tuned in previously, these webinars are delivered by aligning actionable governance with the Aon Independent Schools Risk Report. Each month, we deep dive into the underlying governance issues behind those top risks identified by you and your peers in the independent schools sector. A quick housekeeping reminder, we are live, but the webinar is being recorded and made available to those that could not attend. So given we're live, please ensure that you are on mute and stay on mute for the duration. Before we get into today's topic, here we have a quick recap on the top 5 risk concerns. Risk number 1 is the ability to attract and retain talented staff, including succession planning. Risk 2 is cyber threat. For example, hacking, ransomware, malware, and social engineering. Risk 3, mental health of students and staff. Risk 4, the pandemic risk, including the impact of public health orders. And risk 5, student safety. So a reminder that the key themes here are people first and resilience, which when connected to robust governance practices and risk management frameworks, will allow independent schools to make better decisions, further burnishing their brand and reputation and positioning them to thrive through uncertainty. Today's webinar is related to Risk 2, cyber. I'm Andrew Leahy, Aon's National Education Director. I've been with Aon for 20 years and involved in the education sector since 2007. Returning with me is the wonderful Mercer, CEO and founder of GovernWith, a governance review and capability development technology platform for highly regulated not-for-profit industries. Fee is a governance specialist with over 30 years of executive and governance experience. She has supported over 600 boards through her business, but also gives back personally through various voluntary chair and director roles. Today's subject matter expert is Wayne Grant of Solis. Solis is an award-winning leading provider of managed cybersecurity services and cyber incident response. They have over 20 years experience and over 100 cybersecurity experts globally. Solis are the trusted cyber response firm for CFC underwriting, who ensure the vast majority of Aon's independent school clients. Wayne is a certified information security manager and the principal security consultant for Solis in Australia. He's a member of the Australian Information Security Association and Information Systems Audit and Control Association. Prior to joining Solis, Wayne managed the information security program for Africa's largest banking group between 2010 and 2013. Today's cyber webinar will focus on 3 key areas: cybersecurity, the essential 8 strategies to mitigate cybersecurity incidents, helping schools understand how to mitigate BYOD risk, and a sample of education sector case studies. But before we really get into those, here's some interesting, perhaps surprising stats from our 2022 survey of independent schools. Of the 180 respondents, only 64% of schools have a documented cybersecurity plan. A mere 23% say they conduct employee awareness training. Only 24% have multi-factor authentication for staff when they are connecting remotely to school. However, this has been a subjectivity to protection under the Aon Arranged Insurance policy for 2 years now. 12% have advanced endpoint protection to protect end user devices from being exploited. 18% have network segregation, which help restrict the level of access to sensitive information. 13% have end-of-life software remediation processes for software that is no longer supported by the developer and becomes outdated and unsecure. 23% of schools do not conduct vulnerability scanning. 28% do not conduct penetration testing. So only 3% of survey respondents are actually utilising all of the mentioned key cyber mitigation tactics. These are startling low numbers for a top risk concern. So what is cybersecurity risk? Cybersecurity risk is the risk of financial loss, damage to reputation, or legal liability that arises from unauthorised access to or use of an organisation's information technology systems. Cybersecurity risk can come in many forms, including malware attacks, phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, and data breaches. Ransomware is the #1 threat by far, and it continues to outpace data breach privacy events activity by nearly 300%. Globally, it is estimated that there is a ransomware attack on a business every 11 seconds. One of the biggest challenges that organisations face in managing cybersecurity risk is the rapidly evolving nature of the threat landscape. Cybercriminals are constantly coming up with new and more sophisticated ways to exploit vulnerabilities in IT systems. And this means that organisations must constantly adapt their cybersecurity measures to keep up with the changing threat landscape. Destruction or alteration to student or staff data, loss of goodwill from publicity, breach of data, privacy laws, threats, and ransom for stolen sensitive information all contribute to this risk. And schools are a rich treasure trove of sensitive and personally identifiable information, making them key targets for cyber attacks. So cyber protection is critical, as 24% of schools surveyed have experienced a cyber attack, while 78% are concerned about a future cyber attack. Recent reporting indicates the average cost of a data breach in Australia is around 2.8 million US, up some 30% on prior year. So this is a risk worthy of board attention and risk mitigation investment. From here, I'll pass you over to Wayne.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, scary stats indeed. So thank you for that, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today. I suppose before we jump straight into what the Essential 8 really is, it's worth mentioning that the news media is awash with all the big news outlets are reporting on what's happening to Optus, Medibank, more recently Latitude. But what's featuring less prominently is the fact that we've got small to medium enterprises such as schools and other organizations who are being targeted, if not more than those big organizations. So the Office of the Information Security Council has reported that up to 65% of small to medium enterprises have either experienced a cyber incident or are about to imminently in the next couple of months. So most organizations that we speak to are keen to do something about their cybersecurity posture. They're keen to take action. The predominant question that we get asked is, where do you start? And something that we direct people to is start with what you have. Start with the very basics, especially in a school context where you potentially have a small team. You've either got a managed service provider or you've got a small one person or group of people that look after your IT. Start there and start to get some of the basics right. But it is important to start measuring yourself against a recognized framework, of which there are many from a global context. Something which we find works really well in the Australian landscape is the Australian Signals Directorate's Essential 8. The Essential 8 is a technical framework. It looks at a series of technical controls which organizations can leverage to bench themselves from a maturity perspective. It was first published in 2017. It's very relevant to the Australian marketplace. But I will suggest that it's a good starting point. It's somewhere where you can start to look at the technical controls that you have in place and work from there. It certainly isn't the be all and end all. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has approximately 37 controls that they like to make use of, which the Essential 8 are the top 8 that we typically work with. So as mentioned, what we do is we work with organizations such as yourselves. We will go in and look to benchmark you against these 8 core streams of work. Now, as you can see there, the 8 are specifically designed to effectively manage 3 key areas. And one is to prevent attacks. Obviously, we're trying to keep the wolves at bay, for lack of a better phrase. We're trying to build that perimeter around organizations such as yourselves to make sure that you're safeguarding yourself against the day-to-day onslaught from the threat actors that are out there. But we have to take the stance of it's not a case of if, but when. So in the event that you are breached or you do experience a malicious actor getting into your environment, what we want to then do is limit the scale of that attack. We want to restrict the damage that could be inflicted. And the other and more important aspect to all of this is how quickly can you recover? So even with big organizations, it's that time to recover is the part that effectively can destroy an organization's brand, can really eat into your resources, because if you're taking a long time to stand up your business again, that is where some of your largest costs to your organization are going to be incurred. As I mentioned, the Essential 8 is measured against effectively 4 maturity levels, starting at a base level of 0, and then moving progressively through 1, 2, and 3. Now, many organizations that start out achieve a 0 in one or many of the Essential 8 pillars. What I want to stress to organizations is that doesn't mean that you've done nothing about your cybersecurity. It just means that you've not ticked all the boxes in terms of achieving a maturity level 1. And that is where you need a practitioner to assist you in closing out all those gaps and help you get to that level 1. What I will also say is that many organizations choose not to go for a level 3. Level 3 is when you're sitting in a large banking environment, or you're sitting in a sector where you are protecting a huge amount of personally identifiable information. You've got elements of critical infrastructure, or something which is a very heavily regulated environment. But for many organizations, getting to that level 3 can be cost and time prohibitive. So it's not to suggest that any organization should ultimately always try and achieve that level 3. So as I mentioned, just to take a step back, the first port of call for many organizations is they ask the simple question of, so where do I start? Where do I gain that foothold to make sure that what I've got can be maximized? Is there any potential to shore up some of the gaps in a very cost-effective manner, which I'm not necessarily going to have to go to the board and ask for large sums of money to invest in technology, or bringing in an independent contractor to come and change things up? So it's very important for schools to think about the ways in which they can utilize a lot of the tech that they've already got in place. What I will do is also just cover off on the complexity that I know that many of you are dealing with. To add to the situation of looking at how best you can shore up your security, I'm very aware, and at Solis we're very aware from a school perspective, that you're sitting with a very fragmented environment. You've often got your, let's call it, corporate technology stack. So you've got servers, on-prem servers, you might have cloud environments, you've got your own issued devices, but at the same time, you're opening your networks to people who are bringing their own devices into your networks. What we're finding is many of the schools are not segmenting their networks properly to ensure that they are keeping the right devices contained, so that they don't have free range to get to all the data points that you're trying to keep them away from. So that's something also to bear in mind. The Essential 8 doesn't necessarily call out elements like network segmentation overtly, but again, if you're going to engage with a security practitioner, it's something to just bear in mind that, as I mentioned, the Essential 8 is a great starting point, but there will be other key elements that you need to consider when putting together a cyber strategy for your organization. The other key thing to bear in mind is that you've got this layer of complexity around the devices, but you've also got all these entry points. Very often you've got portals that you've established for your past pupils, you've got tuck shop order systems, you've got environments where people can go in and purchase school uniforms. And bearing in mind, as soon as you've got anything that's internet facing, you really need to consider, how are you securing those environments? Very often they are outsourced. So I do appreciate that you've transferred that risk to an external supplier that may be managing that, but I still think it's very incumbent on you to make sure that the level of security that they are applying correct, and effectively treat them as a third-party vendor, or that third-party risk, which we're seeing happening more and more in the supply chain elements. The other aspect to bear in mind is you've got a lot of what we call the Internet of Things. Very often we safeguard all our systems. We put barbed wire fences around our servers and ensure that we've got what we think needs to be secured, really secured. There are documented cases where people have got into universities, got into schools, plugged a USB stick into a photocopier in the library and downloaded an absolute treasure trove of information because those endpoint devices have not been secured. Likewise, in hospitals, we encounter the exact same thing with X-ray machines and all the rest. So it's very important to not just assume that because you've had somebody come onto your site and install CCTV cameras, for instance, that they are going to be secure. Yes, they offer security functionality so that you can see who is physically coming into your premises and accessing certain areas within your schools, but it's just as important to ensure that you don't have people also accessing those devices and utilizing them for malicious activities. So to come back to the Essential 8 and why it's so important, it's a good starting point for you to really analyze where some of the gaps are that you may have within your environments. Certainly key aspects need to be looked at. You do have elements of the Essential 8 which are a bit more challenging than others, such as the application control or whitelisting aspects that most organizations find is one of the more challenging pillars within the Essential 8. But there are others which you potentially already have some functionality in place or just need to activate some of that functionality that's inherent in some of the Microsoft tools that you already have. What I would suggest is really focus on elements such as multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is a great mechanism to safeguard yourselves against key issues such as ransomware. We're noting that in environments where people have implemented a solid multi-factor authentication or two-factor, as many people refer to it, are far less likely to succumb to a ransomware attack, purely because you've added that additional layer of security and you just make it that much harder for the threat actors to try and bypass your controls. The other key areas is to make sure that you're managing the patching of your operating systems and your applications. Far too often we're seeing the threat actors exploiting vulnerabilities within those environments and within those systems. As soon as a vulnerability becomes known, and let's face it, almost all operating systems and applications have vulnerabilities because that's just the nature of the way in which they're developed and pushed out to the market. Hence, the likes of Apple sending out updates as regularly as they do. It's important to make sure that you've got somebody who's on top of this and making sure that you've on the latest version of the software that you're using, etc., because that is still a popular way within which threat actors will try and get into your environment. And as I've mentioned, I'm not a doomsday, don't profess to love the whole doomsday theory of things, but certainly we're up against it. It's not a case of if, but when. And what we really want to see is organizations such as yourselves become more resilient, to be able to recover quickly. And that means making sure you've got proper backup strategy in place. You're doing proper backups. You're keeping key records offline, offsite, so that you can restore back to a point from which you can then start to operate again. And then there's a couple of other issues which, again, as I said, you can very easily bolt onto the Essential 8. Key elements that should never be underestimated around awareness training, around making sure that you've got the proper governance. People understand who needs to make certain decisions, who will make a call if you need to recover data. It's simple things like that you can start to bring into your environments and which will stand you in good stead for when and if something should happen. The last slide I'll briefly take you through is just to give you some examples of some of the schools that we at Solis have dealt with and helped through incidents. Now, this is certainly not a finger pointing exercise. I really don't want people to feel that way. What we have to do is we have to learn from these issues. It's the way in which we can bring a good cyber safety culture into our environments is by that continuous learning cycle and continuous improvement. And the only way we can do that is by sharing this type of information. As you can see, we've got threat actors. REvil are on the international scene. They are well known as key threat actors that target multinational organizations, but yet they still target schools. They see that there's some value in it in schools for them to go after schools and try and get that information. There's nobody that's off limits to these guys. You have to understand that everybody's fair game when it comes to this. And as you can see, the type of incidents, ransomware is still by far the most predominant in that space. What I'll do is I'll also cast your eye to the bottom. That isn't a typing mistake where we've got school 5 listed 3 times. Again, it's not to point a finger at school 5. I think what I want to stress to all of you is there is a lot of research, a lot of data coming out of various markets that suggest that just because you've been breached, just because you've had an incident happen in the past, certainly does not make you immune to the fact that you could succumb to another attack. In actual fact, I think current research suggests that many of the larger organizations that have been targeted, very often the exact same threat actor will loop back around in approximately 9 months to come and test the fence, for lack of a better phrase, to see if you've made any changes, to see if you've made any improvements, because if you haven't, potentially they'll target you again. So it's important to note that there is no immunity from this. You don't get to suffer through it once and then feel that you've had your turn and now they'll move on to other people. It's very prevalent, and we have people that will constantly come back at you to see if they can potentially derive even more value out of your heartache and the pupils and the various groups that you're trying to protect. Yeah, thank you for that. And as I said, start small, start with the basics and work from there.
Okay, Fee, over to you to talk about the board's role with cyber.
Yes, Andrew, thank you. And fantastic information, Wayne. Honestly, it's crucial. So I think the key thing, Andrew, that we need to point out is for a long time, I think boards have thought anything to do with this is basically management's role, but it's now a top risk organisation-wide, and boards need to lead on top risks. And the interesting thing that we've discovered, so a bit like you, Wayne, with all of the reviewing and what have you do into the cybersecurity situation, we review and develop the boards and the individual directors. And what we've discovered in our most recent reviews is that the overall director capability, where directors actually assess their own skills, is 27% out of 100. In other words, directors are saying honestly, our least capability is in this cybersecurity area. So what boards need to do first and foremost is to actually have a look at themselves and identify where do they sit on this capability scale and what do they actually know at this point in time about their role in leading on cybersecurity. And I think the education boards, there's a real call to action for you, because you're the 3rd most targeted boards, and according to Wayne, the most likely to have a repeat attack as well. So Andrew, it's a real issue for our boards.
It is. It's certainly a board level issue. Here's some top tips, Fee, that you'd like to share.
Yes. So I think first and foremost, cybersecurity does now sit with the board. It sits with the board along with workforce issues and some of those other things that in the past we've thought is management's job. You need to work with the executive, and boards and the executive need to upskill together and look at those 8 things that Wayne's talked about today. We need to actually recruit directors with cyber skills. And we also need to say, we can't just then sit back and go, oh, good, there's those directors with cyber skills. All of us need to develop on the board a fundamental or foundation understanding about cyber. We also need to make it a strategic pillar. It's incredibly important that it becomes a strategic focus. We need to do scenario planning about cyber attacks and the consequences before it actually happens, or if you listen to Wayne, after it happens, because it's probably going to happen again. A lot of our boards have got subcommittees that focus on cybersecurity. That's a really important one. And cyber needs to be a standing item on the board agenda. Nothing manages a top risk better than having it as a standing item. And why not start each board meeting with a cybersecurity story, at least for the next little while until we get our heads around this really important subject.
So in summary, growing awareness of cyber risk is certainly a board level issue. And with appropriate governance in place, as well as secure IT systems, education for all staff and students needs to be a primary objective. Without a focus on the mitigation tactics that have been shared today, you'll start to struggle in obtaining insurance protection, but more importantly, your school will be exposed. My message to you all here today is to be proactive, not reactive. The latter comes with a risk to your brand and reputation, a risk to your enrolment numbers, and a risk to the balance sheet. The environment is certainly tough, but we're all here to help. Wayne, thank you both for providing wonderful insights today. That brings us to a close of the formal presentation. Thank you to our listeners for giving up some of your precious time, and I hope each and every one of you have taken something valuable away from the information shared. Till next time, all the best. See you on webinar 6.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Wayne.
Thanks, team.